One day, a CEO disguised himself to secretly tour his own company. But the moment he saw a black janitor quietly weeping in the corner, he had no idea that the next few moments would change his life forever. The morning was quiet when Richard Walker stepped out of his sleek black car and adjusted the collar of his jacket. For everyone else, he was just another man passing by on Main Street. But behind his ordinary clothes and discreet glasses was the CEO of one of the country's fastest-growing retail chains. He had built the company with relentless ambition, but in recent months he had heard whispers. Rumors that things inside the stores weren't what his managers reported. Sales were steady, yes, but there was talk of employees feeling invisible, overworked, and even mistreated. So Richard had decided to do something unusual, something few CEOs dared. He would go undercover. Disguised as a new part-time worker, he walked into one of his oldest stores in a predominantly black neighborhood. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, the faint scent of cleaning products hung in the air, and the sound of customers moving through aisles filled the space. Richard pulled on his company-issued apron, trying to blend into the rhythm of the morning. He greeted customers, stocked shelves, and even swept the floor, unnoticed as anything other than another worker trying to earn a day's wage. Hours later, while carrying a box of supplies to the back, Richard caught a sound that didn't belong. A muffled sob, low but aching, echoed from the janitor's closet. He paused, uncertain. Slowly, he pushed the door open, and there he saw him. An older black man in a faded uniform crouched on a stool, his head buried in his rough, calloused hands. Tears streaked down his cheeks, falling onto the gray floor beneath. Richard froze. He had never seen one of his employees cry in private before. He didn't even know this man's name. All he knew was that here, in a hidden corner of his store, someone was carrying a weight heavy enough to break through years of silence. "Are you all right, sir?" Richard asked softly, careful not to startle him. The janitor looked up, startled and embarrassed. His eyes were tired, the kind that told a history of long nights and too many burdens. "I'm fine," he muttered, wiping his face with the sleeve of his shirt. But the tremble in his voice betrayed him. Richard stepped closer, his tone gentle. "It doesn't look fine. I don't mean to intrude, but sometimes it helps to talk." The janitor let out a long breath and shook his head. "Talking doesn't change nothing. Folks like me, we just keep going, no matter what. Crying's just a weakness." Richard felt a pang of guilt. He had spent years in boardrooms, making decisions about salaries, store policies, and budgets. He had convinced himself that the numbers told the story. But here, in this closet, was the human cost that numbers never showed. "What's your name?" Richard asked quietly. The man hesitated, then answered. "Walter. Walter Green." Richard nodded. "Well, Walter, sometimes strength isn't about holding everything in. Sometimes strength is surviving long enough to finally let it out." Walter's eyes narrowed, searching the young man before him. He didn't know that he was speaking to the CEO, the very man who owned the walls around them. To him, Richard was just another employee, someone with soft hands who didn't yet know how harsh life could be in a uniform like his. "You wouldn't understand," Walter said bitterly. "You've probably never had to mop floors while folks step over you like you're invisible. Never had your boss call you boy, even though you're pushing 60. Never had to choose between paying rent and buying medicine." Richard swallowed hard. The sting in Walter's words was real. For a moment, he considered revealing who he was, but something held him back. To confess now would shatter the fragile trust forming between them. Instead, he simply sat down on the opposite stool, lowering himself to Walter's eye level. "Maybe you're right," Richard admitted. "Maybe I don't know, but I'd like to." Silence hung between them, heavy as iron. Walter studied him, searching for mockery, for pity, for any sign that this was just another cruel joke life had played on him. But all he found was sincerity. Slowly, As though a dam had cracked, Walter began to speak. He spoke of years spent cleaning after others, of bosses who looked at him but never saw him, of customers who tossed trash on the floor just to watch him pick it up. He spoke of his wife, gone too soon, and his daughter, working 2 jobs while trying to finish college. He spoke of pain in his joints, ignored because he couldn't afford a doctor. And then, with a voice breaking under the weight of his own shame, he confessed the reason for his tears. "They told me I was being written up again," Walter whispered. "Said I was too slow. Said customers complain when they see me. I've worked here 15 years, and now they're talking about letting me go. At my age, what else am I supposed to do? Where am I supposed to go?" Richard felt the words strike deep. A man who had given his labor for over a decade was being discarded like a broken broom. Not because he had failed, but because he had grown older, slower, less convenient. And worse, because his skin made him an easy target for blame. Walter pressed his palms together, his voice trembling. "I've done everything right. I show up on time. I work hard. I never steal, never raise my voice. But still they look at me like I don't belong. Like I'm dirt on the floor I clean." Richard clenched his fists, rage boiling beneath his calm exterior. He had trusted his managers to uphold dignity, to treat every worker as a human being. But here was proof that dignity had been stolen, justice ignored, and humanity reduced to tears in a janitor's closet. "Walter," Richard said firmly, "you deserve better. You deserve respect. And I promise you, this isn't the end of your story." Walter gave a bitter laugh. "Promises don't pay the bills, son." But Richard's eyes burned with something Walter hadn't seen in a long time. Conviction. He didn't know who this young man really was, but in that moment, he felt a flicker of something he thought he had lost: hope. The rest of that day passed in a blur for Richard. He worked silently, his mind replaying Walter's words again and again. Every mop stroke, every shelf he stocked, carried the echo of a man's broken dignity. Richard could hardly look at the other employees without wondering how many more had similar stories. How many walked in every day with quiet pain, unseen by the suits at headquarters. By the time the evening shift wound down, Richard had made up his mind. He would not leave this store without understanding the truth of what was happening inside its walls. The next morning, he returned before sunrise, blending again into the uniform of an ordinary worker. Walter was already there, shuffling slowly into the store, his gait marked by stiffness in his knees. He didn't complain, didn't limp, didn't beg for sympathy. He simply clocked in and began sweeping the entrance as if the world didn't notice him. And most of the world didn't. But Richard did. Throughout the day, he observed carefully. The assistant manager, a sharp-faced man in his 30s named Craig, barked orders at the staff with a tone that carried no respect. When Walter moved a little slower, Craig rolled his eyes and muttered loud enough for others to hear. "Old man should have retired 10 years ago." Employees snickered, pretending not to hear, while Walter lowered his head and kept working. Richard's jaw tightened. This wasn't just poor management. It was humiliation. The company had policies about dignity and inclusion, yet here in this store, the words were empty ink on paper. At lunch, Richard sat with a group of employees. They chatted cautiously, testing how much they could trust him. He asked gentle questions, careful not to sound too curious. Soon, the stories began to surface. Low wages, punishments for minor mistakes, hours cut without warning, and, whispered with nervous glances, racial slurs that slipped out from supervisors when no customers were around. "Walter gets it the worst," a young cashier admitted softly. "He does more than half of us combined, but Craig's always on him. Calls him lazy, useless. Once I even heard him call Walter boy." Richard's stomach turned. That word carried a history of chains and whips, of generations reduced to less than human. And here it was, casually spat at a man who had given 15 years of service. Later that evening, Richard sought Walter again. He found him sitting outside during a short break, a small paper bag of food on his lap. Walter pulled out a sandwich. Nothing more than 2 slices of bread with a thin smear of peanut butter. Richard sat beside him quietly. "Didn't bring lunch?" Walter asked, noticing Richard had nothing. Richard shook his head. "Not today." Without hesitation, Walter broke his sandwich in half and handed a piece to him. "Here, can't work on an empty stomach." Richard stared at the offered bread, humbled beyond words. This man, who had so little, still thought to share. It was dignity in its purest form. Not the kind handed out by managers or written in handbooks, but the kind born of humanity. "Thank you," Richard said quietly, accepting the half-sandwich. They ate in silence for a while, watching cars pass on the street, their taillights fading into dusk. "Walter," Richard began carefully, "why do you stay? After everything they've put you through, why keep coming back?" Walter's eyes lingered on the horizon. "Because this job keeps the lights on. Because my daughter still needs help with tuition. Because men like me don't get second chances. We take what we're given and make the best of it. That's what survival is." The words cut deep. Richard thought of his own life. His corner office, his expensive car, his comfortable home. He had fought to build his empire, yes, but he had also been given opportunities, mentors, doors opened by privilege. Walter had fought just as hard, yet the world gave him broom handles instead of boardrooms. That night, Richard lay awake in a modest hotel room, unable to sleep. He thought of his company, the mission statements hanging proudly on walls, the speeches he had given about equality and respect. And he realized something devastating. None of it mattered if, in the places where his people lived and worked, injustice was allowed to rot unchecked. The following day, Richard made a decision. He would confront Craig, the assistant manager, but not yet as the CEO. He wanted to see the truth laid bare. He approached Craig during a shift change, carrying a mop bucket as though he were still just another worker. "Excuse me," Richard began. "Walter asked me to help with the backroom cleanup. Is that all right?" Craig sneered. "Walter asked you? Don't listen to him. He's too old to know what he's doing. Just make yourself useful and stay out of my way." Richard pressed. "He's been here a long time, hasn't he?" Craig smirked. "Yeah, too long. The guy's dead weight. I've been trying to push him out for months. He can't keep up, and customers don't like seeing an old black man shuffling around with a mop. Doesn't look good for business." The words landed like acid. Richard's grip on the mop tightened until his knuckles whitened. Here it was unfiltered truth. A man's worth reduced not only to speed or efficiency, but to the color of his skin and the wrinkles on his face. "Don't worry," Craig added carelessly. "He'll be gone soon. I'm writing him up again this week. After that, he's out. Corporate doesn't care as long as the numbers look good." Richard's chest heaved with controlled fury. Corporate. That was him. He was the one Craig assumed didn't care. And maybe, by being distant all these years, by trusting reports instead of lives, he had unknowingly allowed men like Craig to thrive. But no more. Later that evening, Richard found Walter again. He wanted to reassure him, to promise that everything would change. But when he saw Walter sweeping quietly, his shoulders bent but his pride still intact, he realized something important. This story wasn't just about one man being saved by a powerful CEO. It was about justice, dignity, and truth finally being seen. Richard stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Walter, I need you to trust me. Something's going to happen soon. And when it does, I want you to remember this moment. You are not invisible, and you are not alone." Walter looked at him, confusion flickering in his eyes. But beneath it, for the first time in years, was a fragile spark of belief. The day of reckoning came sooner than Richard expected. On a Friday morning, the store buzzed with activity. Customers filled the aisles, employees rushed to keep up, and the assistant manager strutted about with his usual air of authority. Richard, still in disguise, moved among them, carrying out simple tasks. But today his mind was clear. It was time to reveal who he really was. He waited until mid-morning, when the break room filled with staff. Walter sat quietly at the corner table, eating another meager sandwich, while others laughed, scrolled through phones, or vented about work. Craig, the assistant manager, entered with a clipboard and his usual smirk. "Walter Green," Craig barked. "Stand up." The room fell silent. Walter looked up, confusion on his tired face. "I've written you up again," Craig declared loudly, waving a paper in the air. "That makes 3, which means, old man, you're finished. You can collect your things after your shift, if you even last that long." Murmurs rippled through the room. Some employees looked away in shame. Others exchanged uneasy glances. No one dared speak. Walter, his hands trembling, tried to rise. "Sir, please," he said softly. "I've worked here 15 years. 15 years too long." Craig cut him off. "You should be grateful we even let you mop the floors this long. You're lucky we didn't replace you sooner." Walter's shoulders slumped, the fight draining from his body. The humiliation stung deeper than any physical wound. In that moment, Richard could bear no more. He rose slowly from his chair, every eye turning toward him. "That's enough," Richard said, his voice calm but carrying a weight that silenced the room. Craig frowned. "Who the hell are you to tell me what's enough? You're just some new hire. Sit down before you're out the door too." Richard's eyes locked on him, unflinching. "You want to know who I am?" He removed his glasses and set them on the table. Then, with steady hands, he pulled the company badge from his pocket, the one he hadn't shown in days. Gasps filled the room. "My name," Richard said evenly, "is Richard Walker. I am the CEO of this company, and I've spent the last week working beside all of you, seeing what really happens in this store." The silence that followed was electric. Craig's smirk vanished, replaced by a look of panic. Employees exchanged stunned looks. Walter froze, his sandwich slipping from his hand. Richard stepped forward, his voice steady but full of fire. "I built this company on the belief that every single employee deserves dignity, respect, and fairness. But what I've seen here is the opposite. I've seen bullying, humiliation, and racism disguised as management. I've seen hard-working people treated as if they're disposable. And I've seen a man who gave 15 years of his life reduced to tears in a janitor's closet because of the cruelty of those who should have supported him." Walter lowered his head, ashamed, but Richard turned to him directly. "Walter Green, you are not invisible. You are not disposable. And you are not finished here. As long as I am CEO, your job is safe. In fact, I owe you an apology for letting this happen under my watch, for allowing men like Craig to believe that cruelty is leadership." Tears welled in Walter's eyes. For years, he had endured silently, believing no one at the top even knew his name. And now, the man at the very top was standing before him, defending him, honoring him. Richard faced Craig next. His tone hardened. "And you've abused your power, violated company policy, and disgraced this store. Effective immediately, you are suspended pending termination. You have no authority here anymore." Craig sputtered, his face red. "You can't." "I can," Richard interrupted coldly. "And I just did." The room erupted in whispers. Some employees smiled behind their hands. Others exhaled in relief. For the first time, the toxic weight of fear lifted. But Richard wasn't done. He turned back to the employees. "Listen to me. This company will not survive if we allow injustice to take root in our stores. You deserve better, every one of you. From this day forward, I am implementing a new program. Any employee, in any store, who feels mistreated will have a direct line to headquarters. No more walls between you and me. If you're working hard, if you're showing up, you will be respected. The employees stared, stunned. For years, corporate had felt like a distant fortress, unreachable, indifferent. And now, the CEO stood in their break room, promising change. Richard walked back to Walter, placing a hand gently on his shoulder. You've carried more than your share of burdens, Walter. And you've done it with dignity, even when no one recognized it. From this day forward, you'll be more than just the man with the mop. You'll be part of a new employee council, helping us make sure no one else goes unseen. Walter's lips trembled. He struggled for words, finally whispering, "Why me?" "Because you've lived it," Richard replied softly. "Because you know what dignity feels like when it's stolen, and when it's restored. And because your story is the truth this company needs to hear." The room broke into quiet applause. It wasn't loud or rehearsed, but it was genuine. Walter wiped his eyes, overwhelmed. For the first time in decades, he felt seen. Not as a janitor, not as someone stepped over or pushed aside, but as a man whose life mattered. As the shift ended and employees left with whispers of hope, Richard lingered with Walter. The evening sun spilled golden light across the store entrance. Walter looked at him, still uncertain if this was real. "You don't know what this means to me," Walter said quietly. "To finally not be treated like trash." Richard shook his head gently. "No, Walter, you've never been trash. You've always been the foundation. Men like you are the reason this company exists. And I promise you, we will honor that from now on." Walter exhaled, a long breath that seemed to carry years of weight away. He smiled faintly, a smile that carried sorrow and pride in equal measure. Richard knew the journey wasn't over. One store was only the beginning. But tonight, in this place, a truth had been spoken, a wound acknowledged, and dignity restored. The following weeks brought a quiet transformation to the store. For years, employees had walked its aisles with downcast eyes, weighed down by fear of reprimand or dismissal. Now, there was a different air, subtle at first, like the first rays of dawn. People greeted each other more openly. Laughter returned to the break room. And most of all, Walter Green walked a little taller. He was still the janitor, still pushing his mop and emptying trash cans. But something fundamental had shifted. When he moved through the store, his co-workers now nodded with respect. Customers noticed, too. Some even smiled, watching the older man work with quiet dignity, as though sensing that his story carried weight. Richard, for his part, kept returning, sometimes unannounced, sometimes quietly in the corner, blending in with the workers. He didn't come to inspect, but to listen. He sat with cashiers at lunch, asked stockers about their hours, helped Walter with his rounds. He wasn't there to play the role of the distant CEO anymore. He was there as a man who had finally seen the truth of his company from the ground up. One evening, as the store was closing, Richard and Walter found themselves alone in the parking lot. The air was cool, the hum of streetlights buzzing overhead. Walter leaned on his mop handle, staring at the stars as though they carried answers. "You've changed things," Walter said softly. "Not just for me, for everyone. But I still don't understand why. Men in your position, they don't usually care." Richard paused, searching for the right words. "Because I realized I was blind. I thought success was numbers on a chart, profit margins, market shares. But none of it means anything if the people making it happen are suffering in silence. You showed me that. Your tears in that closet did what years of reports never could. They told the truth." Walter nodded slowly. "Truth's a heavy thing. sometimes too heavy for men to carry. But you carried it. Richard shook his head. No, Walter. You carried it. For 15 years you carried it. I'm just finally listening. There was silence between them, filled with the hum of the night. For the first time, Walter felt something he hadn't in decades. Pride that wasn't just personal, but shared, recognized, validated. Months later, Walter stood on a stage he never imagined. The company held its annual conference, gathering hundreds of employees from across the country. When Richard introduced him as the newest member of the Employee Dignity Council, the applause shook the hall. Walter, dressed in a simple suit borrowed from his brother-in-law, stood at the podium with trembling hands. I don't know much about speeches, he began, his deep voice echoing. I only know about work. Work that breaks your back. Work that nobody thanks you for. For years, I thought that was my lot in life. To sweep floors until I couldn't anymore, and then fade away. But I was wrong. I see now that even a janitor has a voice. That even a man who cleans up after others can stand here and be heard. The room was silent, every eye fixed on him. I stayed in the shadows too long, Walter continued. Not because I wanted to, but because I believed I didn't belong anywhere else. But the truth is, we all belong. Whether you wear a tie, a cashier's apron, or hold a mop, we all deserve respect. And I'm going to spend whatever years I've got left making sure no one forgets that. The standing ovation that followed was unlike anything Walter had ever experienced. He blinked against the bright stage lights, humbled yet proud. For the first time in his life, he wasn't invisible. He was seen. He was honored. Richard watched from the wings, his chest tight with emotion. This was more than corporate reform. This was justice, delayed but not denied. In the months that followed, Walter's story spread beyond the company. Local newspapers picked it up, then regional outlets, until finally it became national news. CEO goes undercover, discovers janitor's tears and a broken system. Letters poured in from strangers across the country, many sharing their own stories of discrimination, invisibility, and survival. Some wrote to thank Walter for his courage. Others wrote to confess that they, too, had once looked past the janitor, the cashier, the delivery driver, never seeing the human being behind the uniform. His story forced people to look again, to see what they had ignored. Walter never grew wealthy. He still lived in his modest apartment, still rode the same bus to work. But now, when he walked into the store, people greeted him with a warmth that money could never buy. And in his heart, he carried something richer than any paycheck, dignity restored. One evening, long after the media attention had faded, Walter sat with his daughter in their small kitchen. She had graduated college by then, her diploma hanging proudly on the wall. She looked at her father, her eyes shining. Daddy, she said softly, you always told me to keep my head down, to work hard to survive. But now you've shown me something else. You've shown me that we don't just survive. We stand. We speak. We change things. Walter's throat tightened. He reached across the table and took her hand. No matter what they take from us, he whispered, they can't take our dignity. Not if we hold on to it. That night, he went to bed with peace in his heart. For the first time in years, the weight on his shoulders was lighter. And as for Richard, he carried Walter's story with him always. In boardrooms, in shareholder meetings, in every decision he made, he asked himself one question. What would Walter see in this? Would it honor him? Would it honor the people who make this company real? The undercover CEO had come into the store searching for answers. What he found was far greater. He found truth in a janitor's tears, justice in a quiet man's dignity, and a reminder that no title, no power, no wealth meant anything without humanity at its core. And so, the story of Walter Green became more than a corporate tale. It became a testament. a reminder that even in the hidden corners of the world, in the closets where men cry unseen, there is truth worth hearing, dignity worth defending, and lives worth honoring. Because sometimes the strongest men are not the ones in suits, but the ones holding mops, carrying burdens heavier than most will ever know, and still finding the strength to stand. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to give it a like, share it with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories that inspire and move you.